Hello, everyone. Welcome to Writers and Books Visiting Authors Series. My name is Dan Hurd. I'm the Director of Adult Programs. Writers and Books is a nonprofit literary arts center in Rochester, New York. We offer readings, workshops, and literary programming for people of all ages, all currently available online. Our theme for 2021 is Taking Care. We're celebrating different ways we can take care of ourselves and take care of others this year. You can check out our upcoming schedule at wab.org. Please say hello in the chat and let us know you're there. Feel free to submit questions to the Q&A function. Books are available through our bookstore &Books. I'll put the link in the chat. We're so excited to have Joanna Scott with us this evening. First, we'll hear her read, then she'll be in conversation with author Stephen Schottenfeld. Stephen Schottenfeld's novel Bluff City Pawn was published by Bloomsbury, USA. His stories have been published widely and have received special mention in both the Pushcart Prize and Best American Short Story anthologies. He teaches English at the University of Rochester. Joanna Scott is the author of 10 novels, including Arrogance, a PEN/Faulkner finalist, The Mannequin, a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize, and Follow Me, a New York Times notable book. She has also published 2 previous collections of short fiction, Various Antidotes and Everybody Loves Somebody. Her awards include a MacArthur Fellowship, a Lannan Literary Award, and a Guggenheim Fellowship. She is the Roswell Smith Burroughs Professor of English at the University of Rochester. Kirkus Review says about her latest collection, Excuse Me While I Disappear. Scott approaches these lyrical stories with a gem-like precision and economy of language. Like a good museum, the collection entices the reader to look again, both at the stories themselves and the world beyond these pages. A beautiful gallery of meditations on language, mortality, and the attempt to leave a lasting mark on the world. Joanna, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for having me. It's great to be involved with Writers and Books. I have a long affiliation with this wonderful organization. When I first moved to Rochester, way back before you were born, Stephen, I lived in the Flatiron Building on University, right next to Writers and Books. And my old professor at Brown, where I'd been a graduate student, had told me about the organization and told me to go seek out Joe Flaherty. He knew Joe Flaherty as a guy who drove around the country with his bookmobile. So Joe had settled in Rochester by then, started Writers and Books. So I marched down to Writers and Books, and gosh, that was back in, I think that was before I was even teaching at the university, back in '85 or something. So I taught a course. The very first course I taught in Rochester was at Writers and Books. So cool. It's still on my screen is this webinar is being recorded. So I'm going to click continue just to get rid of it. Did you do that, Stephen? Yeah. Okay. There we go. Okay. So I wish I could see everybody. I know there are some friends in the audience, and I thank you all for joining us. I guess I'll go ahead and read a little excerpt from the collection of stories. And I would say, just I hope you're all comfortable. I'll read for about 15 minutes, I think. And sit back, pour yourself a glass of something and enjoy. I'm going to read a story called The Maverick, which is the only story I've written narrated by a dancing bear. Many of you will recognize the bear's friend, who is an important figure in Rochester history, Sam Patch. I, of course, couldn't live in Rochester without writing something about Sam Patch. So I'll read the story. I'm going to start a little ways into it. I'll read about 6 pages of the story that's called The Maverick. It was long ago, long before your grandparents were born, when a ticket to see a dancing bear cost a mere 2 cents. I listened while he emptied a bottle of brandy and talked about the peculiar sport of jumping waterfalls. But it wasn't a sport to him. It was an art he'd perfected as a boy jumping from the bridge in Pawtucket. The fact that he remained impoverished and unrecognized only made him more certain that he was deserving. He had courage. He had vision. Most important, he had a surefire technique, the details of which he guarded jealously. But the more he drank, the more freely he talked. I kept listening. He must have assumed I couldn't understand. He was a man who wanted to be a hero. I was just a bear, already stiffening with age and growing ever stouter. Wear a snug fitting shirt, he said, and loose pants of white cotton. Breathe in when you leap. Pin your arms against your sides. Bend your knees and snap your legs straight just before you hit the water. Let the current carry you away. Find a rock to hold on to downriver. Only when the audience has concluded that you've been swept to a watery grave should you burst up through the surface and wave to them. Oh, and whenever you jump, make sure you're good and drunk. That's essential. Be a better friend to the bottle than the bottle is to you. He jumped Passaic Falls when he was 27. He jumped from the top of a ship's mast into the Hudson River when he was 28. A few weeks later, he jumped Patterson Falls. Finally, on a rainy October afternoon, when he was 29, he jumped 80 feet over Niagara Falls. That made him famous for certain. But he wasn't famous enough by his own measure. He could never be famous enough. We met in Buffalo. He was wearing a sailor's jacket. I was dancing on a stage at McCleary's museum. He bought me for $10 and led me away on a leash. We sat in a bar. He talked for hours as if he'd never before met anyone willing to listen to him. I listened while he told me about his impossible dream of success. His next jump, he said, would be more daring than the last. He vowed to jump Niagara Falls from a platform 120 feet high. He told me not to warn him against it. He'd made up his mind. I could see he was a stubborn fool, but I also admired him more than I cared to admit. He was the first individual I'd ever met who was truly fearless. He jumped for the second time into Niagara Falls on October 17th. I sat among an audience of ladies who had paid a fee to watch from a boat. He entered the water with one knee bent. The ladies in the boat exclaimed at the splash, and those closest to me buried their trembling fingers in my fur. We all thought he was dead. And then he popped from the water, waved to us, and swam on his back to shore. There are many routes to fame, but the quickest and surest is the one I traversed with my friend, there and back. It's true that almost no one remembers me anymore. I've lived too long. But I once became very famous very quickly. You could do it too. Let me suggest, however, that jumping from a high platform into the falls, wearing a snug-fitting shirt and white trousers, with your arms tight against your sides, won't be enough. Nothing is enough unless you advertise. With each successive jump, he became savvier about publicity. He began printing out announcements headed with his motto, "Some things can be done as well as others," whatever that meant. I never quite understood. He paid boys to put up the flyers around town in stores and music halls and taverns. The point was to convince every segment of the public that there was no better way to spend their time than watching a man risk his life for the sheer thrill of it. They called him doggone crazy back home in Pawtucket. They called him spectacular in Hoboken. They called him astonishing in Niagara. But he wanted more than passing notice. He wanted to have a permanent place in history. He decided that he hadn't paid enough attention to his appearance. He spent his earnings on a manicurist and a shave at the barber. He added a black silk scarf to his wardrobe. He bought himself a pair of gold cufflinks. I could have told him to leave his cufflinks at home. Baubles such as cufflinks are like berries to young bears. The more one has, the more one wants. A few won't satisfy. I should know. It's true that I haven't stripped a bush of berries in a long time, but I'd rather resist temptation than have to suffer when there's nothing left. I won't let myself get started. I don't waste my time remembering that blueberries were once my favorite, or that tender wintergreen can be found growing beneath pine trees. Isn't it better to learn to take pleasure in what is most readily available? Anyway, you didn't seek me out to talk about berries. You want to know about the man who is famous, but not famous enough for jumping from high platforms into the raging tumult of cascading rivers. He had fine gold cufflinks, a silk scarf, a snug-fitting shirt, and white trousers. Add a tried and true technique and several fortifying snifters of brandy, and it still wasn't enough. What was missing, he wondered aloud. We were at an establishment called The Recess, just the two of us. He was scheduled to jump the local falls the next day. He was told to expect a crowd of hundreds, but he wanted a crowd of thousands. How could he make the world stop turning and pay attention to him? I yawned. He watched me on. There you have it. It was late at night and I couldn't help but yawn. He looked into my yawning mouth and saw his future. He saw renown, wealth, adulation beyond anything he'd yet experienced. He followed my wide pink tongue into the black chasm and saw his own potential. The next day, a fine, bright Indian summer day, he invited me to accompany him up to the platform that had been erected above the falls. After delivering his usual speech, in which he compared himself favorably to Alexander the Great, Napoleon, and God, he jumped. Though he was still enjoying the effects of the previous night's brandy, his form was perfect. Arms tight against his sides, knees bent, then snapping straight, so he entered the water with hardly a sound. The audience waited with increasing fear for him to emerge. He didn't emerge for several minutes. Nervous murmurs rippled through the crowd. And then there he was, bobbing along the river, smiling and waving. The audience cheered. Their cheers weren't enough for a man who was born to feel underappreciated. So this is what he did to invite them to cheer louder. He climbed out of the river, up the stone steps to the top of the gorge, and up the ladder to the platform where I was waiting. I noticed that his cufflinks were gone. He smiled at me, a strange and decent smile that made me wonder if he longed for more than fame. And then he shoved me. That's right, he jammed an elbow deep into my fat belly and pushed. I wasn't prepared for the assault, and with a roar of outrage, I fell backward off the platform. As a local newspaper reported, I made several promiscuous turns in midair and then struck the water stern first. What my famous friend discovered was that if you want to succeed, don't try to do it alone. Any challenge is less agreeable when you confront it alone. Find someone you can trust, a loyal, brave collaborator. He trusted me. I listened to his stories, his complaints, his secret dreams. In fact, I trusted him. When he led me away from Jonathan McCleary's Buffalo Museum, he saved me from the humiliation of dancing in public. He wanted me near him. I hadn't been wanted like that since my mother banished me from the den. I was his friend, and he was mine. We were a swell pair. We complemented each other. He liked to talk. I liked to listen. I was content to keep him company until the day he pushed me from the platform over the Genesee Falls. I made a big splash, you might say. The audience loved me. Word got out that the show was going to be repeated. Tempting fate. he scheduled the next jump for Friday the 13th. Unlucky Friday, day of scripted doom. He knew what he was doing. He would suffer. He would be buried. And then, he would rise again, dripping wet and as smug as ever. He would climb out of the river and up the ladder. And then, in front of his biggest audience ever, he would humiliate an old fat bear by pushing him off the platform. Unless I pushed him first. I was trained to survive. I've learned not to be particular. I am as readily satisfied with rotten apples as I am with a hunk of corned beef. The only thing I don't like is to be the center of attention. Survivors will go to great lengths to avoid being the center of attention. I wanted to be overlooked. He wanted to be noticed. There was no greater difference in this between us. Our friendship was testament to the cliche that opposites attract. He trusted me. I wish he could have gone on trusting me to the end. But in the moment after I discreetly bumped him with my hindquarters, knocking him off the platform, he realized that I wasn't a true friend. He had no true friends. He was alone, falling through the air into the river. It was necessary for him to be alone. Instead of falling straight down on this, his final jump, he fell cockeyed. He must have realized what was happening in the split second before it was over. He knew what I'd done to him. He hit the water with a resounding smack. And at last, he became truly famous. The audience refused to believe he died that day. People speculated that he hid in a cave behind the falls until the anxious crowd dispersed. In the months that followed, rumors spread, and my friend was the subject of sightings around the world. He was seen boarding a trolley in San Francisco, riding a bicycle through New York's Central Park, and flying a kite on a beach on the Italian island of Sardinia. The reports continued even after his body was found downriver in the shallows the following spring. He was more famous than he had ever hoped to become, thanks to me. I'm sorry for it. I'm sorry not because I caused him to suffer, but because I let him trick me into helping me achieve his dream. I thought I was saving myself by shoving him before he could shove me. But in that instant when he was tipping backward off the platform, I looked over my shoulder at him. Our eyes met, and I saw a flash of something approaching satisfaction. I earned my keep by giving him the kind of fame that would outlast his lifetime. I turned him into a survivor, the only kind of survivor he ever wanted to be. He finally became a legend on that day, while I was destined to be forgotten. There's no room in his story for an old dancing bear. I was left to climb unnoticed down the platform and slip back into the crowd, taking refuge again in anonymity, condemned to survive in my own way and grow ever older, more haggard, hungrier, lonelier, after having succeeded in losing the only friend I ever had. So that is Sam Patch, Rochester's famous waterfall jumper. And the story fits in the collection as one of many of the stories that is about lost stories. It's about the impossibility of being believed. As a fiction writer, I've often thought about the very premise that we're asked to work with, the premise of fiction, of falsehood, of the lie that underscores everything we try to say as writers in fiction. So in this collection, I've tried to explore what is involved in that leap into fiction, and also ask myself, why do we tell stories? What happens if we lose stories? I found myself thinking a lot about that in these past years. Actually, I started to get the idea of combining the some of the stories I've been writing that were reflective of my concerns into a book. When I went to a meeting about our library and the changes coming up, and I at that point, so this was in 2015, and I wasn't prepared for uh, changes that would involve getting rid of hard copies of books. Like I can totally understand the need for it. I remember, Stephen, I don't know if you were at this meeting, but I remember being
Yeah, I
told
was.
that it cost $4 or something like $4.26 a year to keep a book on the shelf. And I thought, so yeah, why not keep it on the shelf? But space is uh, hard to find and hard to maintain. I understand that, and so some of these changes are inevitable. But um, I did find myself worried about what we'd lose if we did get rid of all the hard copies of books. So I ended up writing a story about that, and then collecting stories and writing more stories that were engaged with the concern about lost stories. So that gives you a little background on the collection. I think I mentioned I read a couple of the very short stories at Writers and Books. Gosh, when was it? It must have been a couple of years ago. Pre-COVID, definitely. And I then I think I was working with the title of this collection. I was just finishing it up then, and working with the title. I wanted to call it Unreadable because these were about stories that couldn't be read, about books that couldn't be read, that had been lost, destroyed, burned, never told, not believed. But then my publisher did not like the title Unreadable. I don't know why. Somehow I thought it was like someone said, "This is an unreadable book." Say, yeah, that's what it is. So um anyway, that gives you a little background on the collection, and it's wonderful to be in conversation with you, Stephen, and see actually what is it on the back. Those are CDs on the CDs and
Yeah.
books. But what
Oh, are there CDs?
are those books?
Those are books.
Those are books.
Yeah.
It is so to see
And
your
this,
library behind you that
this
I
is
think
one
I
of the
see. Is that the
libraries.
priest?
I wanted to ask you about, I mean, in some ways, what you were just talking about kind of fits into some of the first questions I wanted to ask you, because when I saw the title, I was thinking about the Potter's Grand Tour. I was thinking about your interest in disappearance, and things that go away, and I was sort of, I guess I was thinking about the weird time that we're in, where on the one hand, it it feels harder to disappear in, with like global tracking and mapping. It feels harder to
Mm,
kind of get unplugged, go off the grid. But then it also seems like we're in a time where um, we're hyper aware of loss, of disruptions and
mhm, mhm,
extreme weather, and so like the word disappear and just the way that it functions in your book is kind of many-sided. It's on the one hand, it's like a dangerous word. There's like that, don't ever disappear like that again, Jody.
mhm,
And then there are characters that, maybe they suffer, like a novel that disappears, sort of thinking about different states of mind, of amnesia or dementia, or some kind of
mhm,
loss
mhm,
of thought. But then there's something kind of, even just the way you phrase it, excuse me while I disappear. I mean, there's something potentially blissful about it, about disappearing into a book, for a reader or for a writer, or disappearing into a persona, or like a place, like a hidden chamber, or like taking on a disguise. And
mhm.
I was, one of my first questions was to sort of ask you, like, what this this thing of disappearing was as a
Oh, I
organizing principle or central concern. But
I
it
think you
sounds like you talked about it a little bit.
well, as you described it better than I could, because I really like the more obvious side of this would be the I retreat or extraction from the present, but I really like the idea of the immersive experience that you describe. If that when stories do that for us, when books do that for us, it's supremely rewarding. I remember hearing Stuart Dybek at the U of R talking,
Mhm.
and he spoke about writing as being the most solitary of the arts, but also the most collaborative, paradoxically, because the reader is so involved in the making of something. And I really agree with that. In fact, if I could make the process more collaborative from the start, I would welcome that. The collaboration between reader and writer is harder to uh, control, perhaps than in other arts, but that absorption, that falling into something, that the loss even of a sense of self as we become a little forgetful when we're reading something about a invented character, and sort of forget that it is invented, that we're not that character, and start to think and feel in a way that is we're not ourselves anymore. I love that feeling.
Well, I actually that was something else I was going to ask you about, because um I think that's one of the real pleasures of reading your work, or reading, and I think I can feel it. So you've got this novel called Follow Me, right? And then and I when I read Palimpsest, you have a sentence, "Picture the scene with me,"
Mm, mm,
and when I read that, I thought about just like, what does the title of Follow Me mean? And like, what does it mean to have, the author, the narrator slash protagonist, and the reader, the community of readers, that shared concentration, the immersion, the pleasure, the dream making. When you just were reading, you said, "Let the current carry you away." Like,
mm,
I just couldn't help but feel what that means for collaboration. Like
mhm,
like
mhm,
that's. I mean, obviously the writer's crafting it first, so
mhm,
it's
mhm.
it's not a
I,
simultaneous
I
collaboration, but it.
well, I wonder if you feel what I do sometimes in in writing out of a fictional premise. We attend to a specific situation, a setting, a character, but there are opportunities to make sentences that are perhaps really personal, or to say things that uh, belong to the character, but we might have wanted to say, that somehow even to voice them, to write them is revealing. I'm sure other writers out there could weigh in on this. But does that ever happen to you when you're writing, that you're attending to your characters, but finding yourself being surprisingly personal, or
Mhm.
uh, expressing things that would be difficult to express directly in
Yeah,
a public venue.
sure.
So in some ways, and even writing about fame and anonymity, and
Right.
feeling the push pull of that, I found myself, wow, I I um, I can understand that over the years, that push pull of uh, wanting to just be, you know solitary, or having uh, be stay in the shadows, and then we work on books that are meant to be public, and the desire to bring them to the public is, it's a sort of contrary desire that always have, for a long time, been sort of struggling with those contrary impulses. And um, was able to express that a little bit in a story. And then in more directly in response to your question, the few times, and you're right, it's not the only time that I will say, come along with me, picture this,
Right.
I imagine this, to try to um, I suppose um, share with, well, not share, because I know the reader is uh, active and uh, creating something, so that collaborative act that happens together is certainly shaped by the words of the on the page, um, but I have to kind of steer, at the same time recognizing that there's a collaborator who's very independent out there. Every reader is very independent.
It,
Um,
it was, I mean, when you were reading that story, I'm thinking of, Kafka a little bit. And,
mhm, mhm,
um, I mean, I don't mean like I'm thinking of Kafka because you're writing like Kafka. What I mean is just sort of the idea of like a talking bear. When you were talking right
mhm,
now, just the idea of, I guess I was thinking of the Hunger Artist and just like,
mm.
what is it?
Oh, interesting.
What does it mean when the audience turns away from the artist? The audience kind of goes to find, if they lose interest in that endeavor.
Right,
Like,
right.
like
That
when does
that
the disappearing start? Does the
gosh,
disappearing start um after the Hunger Artist dies, before the hunger, when the Hunger Artist is no longer viewed as is no longer seen or
mhm, mhm,
entertained?
mhm.
I,
The story, for in case others haven't read it, the Hunger Artist by Kafka tells the story of a man who performs hunger. He sits in a cage and starves himself for as long as he possibly can, uh, without dying. And though that dying is the ultimate act for him, and so the strangeness of the performance is amplified in this study of hunger, the show of hunger. So it's a great, as you say that, I it's hard to recreate exactly what I was thinking
yeah.
in writing this story, but I bet I was thinking of that. That makes a ton of sense. That the strange performances that we engage in order to be noticed is
Mhm.
that of all stories, that Kafka's Hunger Artist is the the strangest.
Well, the last thing I don't want to harp on the disappearance too much, but I'll
Mhm,
ask you other questions. But I will say that for me, the title "Excuse Me While I Disappeared" felt. I know I've talked about the word disappear, but I felt like the I was both the storyteller, or the
mhm,
narrator or the author,
mhm,
but it was also the object itself. Like, it was also the personification of storytelling, that it was almost like you were merging subject, like the maker and the thing that gets made. I felt
mhm,
like both things were being evoked by
mhm,
"Excuse Me While I Disappear." Like, it wasn't just about the person, the writer itself, but
mhm.
also just like the thousands of years of image making itself.
Right, right. That story, the title story, that Excuse Me While I Disappear, in the collection, uh, is another story that has Rochester roots. A number of these stories do, um, and that one, it's about uh, uh, an electrician who goes to a house to repair a light and meets a very amiable, talkative guy and his family, and ends up thinking he's being befriended when in fact he's not. And it turns out the guy's a DJ for a local radio station, and the next morning tells an insulting story about this electrician. And I actually I had heard the story was generated by the my own experience of hearing a DJ speak, a local DJ speak derogative terms about a workman who had been to his house. And I thought, how
Mm.
could you do that? So that person might be listening right now. That suddenly I was that person. You know, I was the workman listening to this DJ. And at the very end of the story, spoiler alert, it's the character is choosing, because he has so admired this DJ, is choosing whether or not to keep listening to him, and he turns the volume down, and so that, you know, he is it's easy to in that story to, you know, it not register, I suppose, the significance of the volume, but to me as a writer, it's very important that he's in control of that volume and turns it down. You know, there are ways to control our disappearance, and for him, he's really making he's feeling like he's nothing, that he has not, his selfhood has just been erased, but he's also the one controlling the disappearance. So
That that story was really sneaky and really delightful. And the moment, not, I don't want to give anything too much away, but I'll just say that, like, as a writer, when the moment that he accepts the dinner invitation, I just thought, where is this story going? And the delight of that, like, just of, like, not knowing what was, where these two forces that were now meeting and colliding and were sort of driving into the night, into this domestic space. Like, I literally made a note to myself, like, I want what I'm writing to do this, to, like,
well,
have
I immediately think of your own work, for those out there who have not read Stephen's Bluff City Pawn, or that he has a completed novel that is just a burning, intense, quietly suspenseful narrative. And not, you know, a guy comes into a house, looks at a lamp in this new Stephen's new novel. You think, you just know something's going to go wrong. You know, if there's a gun in the pawn shop, something's going to go wrong. So, and yet Stephen's able to keep this, you know, the burner simmering on low, really, really effectively. So I that's a great feeling as a reader, I think, to see something so simple, apparently inconsequential, and to know it's going to have great consequence. And you're able to do that, I think, in a
and
very distinctive way in your work.
did you know, as you were writing the story, you know, okay, I'm going there, like that, uh
I
like,
did in that story.
okay.
Well, actually, I probably didn't know the ending
Okay.
exactly. I was worried about the guy as I was writing. So I was,
Well,
in my old age, I'm trying to be more of an optimist.
mhm.
Does that sound consistent with what you read?
Can I ask you about just just the crafting of a collection, or about stories? The collections have, you know, kind of, you've written them at different points in your career. You know, while you've written, I've lost count. Is it a dozen novels, or you know, it's a
Or books, yeah, not
yeah.
a couple collections of stories, and then yeah.
And so this is your third collection.
Mhm.
And I'm just kind of wondering what that space is for you. If it, you know, the kind of the writing of a story, crafting a story, the assembling it into a collection, you know, just, can you
Mhm, mhm.
talk about that at all?
You know, with every collection, I have organized it in some way that uh, uh, creates a, a, a dome or a frame, or some confining space, that so I can't just write any story, and I can't put in any story, that I have to have some kind of not just thematic, but often a chronological tug to it, that or at least a logical relationship between the parts, that helps me to see what can go in and what needs to stay out. With this story collection, more so than with the previous two collections, I did set myself a separate task to try to vary the structure as much as possible. I just wanted to be able to move in a flexible way. So they're very short stories, very long stories, almost novella length. There are fragmented stories, collage stories, uh, uh, more, monologue forms. So I did, in terms of the form itself of each story, I was trying to vary that, but still attend to the confinements of my concerns, I guess, about storytelling, reading, loss, and disappearance.
I think Dan said we don't have. I would just say that that's one of the beauties of reading the book too, is the movement of the book. I read this book, half of this book, Joanna, when I was at the Adirondacks, and
Oh, excellent.
sometimes you'd see these loons that would go under the water, and reappear way far away, and I felt like that was the experience of with you when I would finish a story and I think, where's this collection going to pop up next,
Yeah, yeah.
1400s or
This it has come up in our conversation, the subject of collaboration, and I Stephen has been a important collaborator, that we read each other's work in progress, and drafts and shreds sometimes, and it starts, and just trying to get a sense of whether there's something viable in a kernel. So that's a different kind of collaboration that's been really important, for me as a writer, and it's been a real pleasure to be able to follow your work and think about it. And I also love, uh, I love getting in when a work is in progress, getting the kind of uh, criticism, we call it, or feedback, or that I when someone can not only tell me what the problem is, but see the answer to it. So you're very helpful in that way. So
thank you.
thank you.
Dan, is it time up?
I'm afraid, yeah, we have to go.
Okay.
But thank you both so much. That was such a great reading, great conversation. Buy their books. The books links are in the chat. I want to thank our funders here. I'll bring them up. Thank you to our funders. I want to thank everyone for coming. You can see this reading and previous readings at our website, wab.org. And I want to thank you all for coming, and have a great night.
Thank you.
Thank you.